Yeah, so now you can see my slides. So hello, my name is Rouvila. I work at Futurize, and I'm here to tell you about this really exciting topic, a tool that I've been using for a year now, and I'm perfectly happy with it. And the tool is called CSS Modules, and it really helps you with writing styles to your application. And it also helps you to prevent the normal difficulties you may have with CSS. And like most of you probably know, it's much easier to write styles to your project when the project is like new and fresh. But when it eventually grows bigger and bigger, it becomes kind of a burden. Oh, what was that? So things like naming your classes becomes really difficult, really fast. So when you end up using all the good class names really quickly, especially if you use like CSS libraries like Bootstrap, and when you try to come up with names, for example, the third different kind of button you have, you end up using something stupid like button 3, for example. And also,
sorry, but could you zoom just a bit, because I'm not sure people in the very back can see.
You can't? Well, it's not that important. That's actually just the minimal viable project. So, and one other thing is that when the project grows, you constantly have to be really careful not to break anything, because you can easily create this web of CSS style dependencies. And CSS also have a lot of other little small annoying problems, and I think most of them are because of this. Can you see what it says? You guys at the back? Yeah, you can see. Alright, good. So all the selectors in CSS, the class names and tag names, are globally scoped. So they're like these people in this pool, and they start pumping with each other, and it's really annoying. You get all sorts of weird behavior from this. And CSS really gives you no structure out of the box for preventing this. And if you imagine CSS being a programming language for a second, it would feel pretty daunting to only have global variables. And you can probably imagine a lot of problems that would come with it. And even the w3schools.com, this is probably not the best source for finding your information about JavaScript, but even this site says that their JavaScript best practice is that you should always avoid global variables and learn how to use closures instead. So people during the couple of last years, some guy from the internet came up with this. BEM. So BEM is like this naming convention for CSS that helps you, excuse me, helps you to avoid this global name spacing problem completely. And by using this strict naming convention, you end up isolating the styles of a specific component so that only the styles of that component apply to that specific component. And if you follow this pattern carefully, it will be also easy to write CSS for your project when the project grows larger. But like one of my co-workers said, it's really awkward when you discover that you have used 3 different naming conventions in your project, and this stuff just happens since we are human. And to me, naming conventions like this kind of feel like a quick fix for a problem much deeper. So, to go back to my original topic, CSS modules, and I have to mention here that if you don't have modern build tools around when you create a project, you should definitely try them if you already haven't. It really helps. But if you do have something like Browserify or Webpack available, you can use CSS modules. And in all the simplicity, CSS modules are just locally scoped CSS files. So, for instance, you can have multiple button classes in multiple different files, and they don't end up colliding with each other. They won't overlap each other anymore. And I've created this example application just for you guys, where I have just two different components: the header and a button, a separate button at the bottom of the page. And as you can see, also the header component has 3 buttons inside of it. And the separate button has a little bit different styles. It's purple and with purple text color. And here is the CSS for it. Can you guys see at the back? Yep. So, as you can see, there's 2 different CSS files, the header CSS and button CSS. And they both include this btn class that is applied for the separate button and the buttons in the header. And normally, if you would just include these style files to the head section of your page, you would end up with this behavior where the other btn class overrides the other one. And this sometimes can lead into weird behavior that you didn't want. For example, now the separate button component is gray for some reason with white text color. But with CSS modules, you don't have this problem anymore, because only the styles from the specific style file apply to that one specific component that you intended to use it for. So, how does this stuff actually work then? CSS modules require this one additional build step. So, what it basically does is that it takes your CSS that you've written yourself, and it can also be less or sus or whatever CSS preprocessor you're using, and it takes that CSS and compiles it into this generated CSS where all the class names are mangled in a way that they are now unique. And now the 2 button classes from the 2 CSS files can live peacefully right next to each other without colliding. But there's one problem. For instance, if you are using React to build components, you are usually using plain strings to represent the class names for different elements. And now, the class names in your component do not match anymore. So, what can you do about this? And here is the trick. You'll have to import the CSS file to your JavaScript component. And the CSS file exports you with this object that has all the keys represent the class names that you've written in your CSS file, and all the values represent the generated CSS file. So now you can just refer to these properties in the style object and everything works. And you end up with this isolation. And like I mentioned earlier, you can use this with both Browserify and Webpack. You can probably use this with some other build tools too, but these are just the ones that I know of. And this is nothing React specific. You can use this with basically any JavaScript framework. For instance, this would be probably pretty good for Angular directives also. And I've heard that in Angular 2 there's a system like CSS modules already built in. So you can just write CSS for a component, and Angular 2 automatically isolates the CSS by using Shadow DOM, I guess. And yeah, so to recap, CSS modules isolates your CSS so that you won't end up with collisions anymore, and you can now use like any class names you want in your CSS in multiple files. So it makes things a bit easier. And also, by doing this, you end up isolating the CSS so that it's much harder now to break anything, like any styles you've written earlier, since there's like the dependency tree of CSS is now gone because all the CSS files are separated from each other. And like when I used CSS modules, I kind of had the feeling of a freshly started project, like constantly. Like even though I have hundreds of different modules, I still feel like the project had just started. And this is of course just for the CSS part of it, but still. Also, one thing that you probably didn't notice is that now you are explicitly defining the dependency with the styles. So for some reason, even still, when we build web applications with this component pattern, we are, well, first of all, we have these awesome components where the logic and the markup is inside of one component. It's like this building block that handles one thing in your application. But for some reason, we still have this huge lump of CSS living in the global scope. And all of your components just kind of rely that CSS is there. But with CSS modules, you end up with this. Now every component handles its own styles and defines them explicitly. And if we imagine that like React component authors, for example, would use this, it would be much easier to start just using a React dropdown for instance. So this is probably a familiar sight to all of us. So if you download a module from npm, you always have the index.js file and some styling comes with it. And you have to figure out a way of integrating this style file to your project. And this can mean a different specific build process, for instance, where you copy the files from the node modules to your project. Also, one benefit that I didn't even realize before starting to do this presentation is that now you are separating the real class names from the actual CSS. So you can refactor the CSS without having to modify the modules anymore, or the components anymore. And it would probably be possible to create some kind of a compiler or a optimizer that would find like common chunks of CSS and combine them in different class names automatically. Because there's no limit of how many class names the CSS file can really export you with. So, this is pretty much everything I had today. One promotion I want to do here is that please join Koodiklinka. It's this great community for programmers like myself. I think a lot of people here are already chatting there, but if you want, please join. It's a great place. Thanks.